Hello and welcome. This is Carl of Nintendo Deep Dive. To those not familiar, this video is part of a larger series concerning the N64 and its software library. In fact, this is the summary to that series. And so we're going to get into all aspects of the N64 as to the best of my ability anyway. I'm going to talk about all the games I've reviewed. I'm going to talk about the hardware, the overarching strengths of it and the overarching weaknesses. I'm going to get into all of that. There's some awards I'm going to hand out that I just came up with just for fun. But before we do all that, I have one final review. And that is for Rayman 2, The Great Escape. Unfortunately, I have no footage for Rayman 2 as I played the 3DS version and I have no capture card or capture card equipped 3DS. I'm pretty sure it's quite difficult to get a 3DS capture unit. Even so, this is a short review. Rayman 2, it's a 3D platformer, but it's not really a collectathon, though there is some collectibles in it. The platforming is pretty simple. There's not a lot going on with it, though it is enjoyable enough, if a little too slow and floaty. But it's a solid enough foundation for the strongest aspect of the game, that being the audio visuals. The visuals, I don't know how to describe them, other than to say they're very French cartoon, whatever that means. I don't know how the French make their cartoons, but this is done by French developers, so it is a French cartoon, I guess, technically. Either way, the visuals are nice. They're a bit zany, but they're very colorful. There's some really nice texture work. It's all very flat, but it's, all cartoony, so it makes sense that it's flat, these textures. Though a lot of these textures, and these high quality textures, that is, they wouldn't really show up in the N64 version of this game. Even better than the look of the game, though, which again I do really like the look, is the music. It reminds me of Danny Elfman at times, and then at other times it seems inspired by late 60s, early 70s rock, like funk rock. And they will kind of just jump between those two styles. And I think it's a very good soundtrack with very, very nice visuals. The one thing that does not work in this game, though, is the combat. Not that it's absolutely terrible or it stops the game dead. It's just completely underbaked and pointless. And the only reason it exists is to remind the player that there is an antagonist. Literally, all you do with the combat is lock onto the enemy, move side to side as they sometimes shoot a projectile at you, and then you throw a energy ball at them, and then they enter a long invincibility phase, and then you hit them again as they get out of it. It's really just underbaked. I don't know. Again, it only exists to remind you that the robot pirates exist in this game. As for the platforming, not just the platforming, really. The level design is interesting in that, aside from some nooks and crannies that you find to discover some hidden lums, there really is no real exploration. But it doesn't use the linearity of the level to construct a tight platforming challenge with well-orchestrated hazards and moving parts. It's all pretty simple, pretty standard fare. There's some fun little ideas here and there, such as if you take a gunpowder keg and put it by a torch, it will turn into a rocket that can propel you through the air for a short time to a out of reach ledge, for instance. Or there's some webs you can climb as you're trying to escape a bigger spider. They have some ideas, and they're not terrible by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not terribly incredible at all. So there's no fun poking around really, and there's no pedal to the metal platforming either. The only section I can think of where there's actually like a bit of pace to the platforming is when the pirate ship is trying to blow down the supports of the walkways that you're on. It's kind of a race to the finish level, dash or die, similar to what you'd find in other platformers. Otherwise, like the one thing that they do to like break up and punctuate this sort of so-so platforming is these fast-paced on-rail sections. And there's a few different variations to them, but they're all the same kind of deviation, really. A fast-paced on-rail section where you kind of just move straight ahead and dodge obstacles by going left or right. They're all pretty much that. So whether you're being dragged across the water by a Loch Ness monster thing, or on a laser zip line, or riding a rocket pony, I think that's what it's called, or that's what it looks like. It's the same kind of thing. And eventually, well, it does, make for a nice change of pace. It's the only change of pace that they offer in the game for the most part. The last thing that's kind of absurd about the game, though, is they have these collectibles, the lums, and you need a certain amount to finish the game, but it's not a great amount of lums that you need. But if you decide to 100% a level, you'll get this kind of crappy mini game where you mash buttons to outrun a pirate who's trying to get to a ferry before you. And that's the same reward for every level as far as I could tell. And I looked it up, and that is the only thing that you get for 100%ing these levels. And it's super hard, and the rewards you get for it are decent enough, but they're also completely unneeded. And should you fail this minigame, it's really weird and complicated and asinine, and the minigame's really hard, and it sucks. So it's kind of a blessing to me that I didn't even have to bother with it to see the lion's share of the game's content. Because, I enjoyed this game enough to play it for 10 hours, and I beat it in about 10 hours. But I didn't want to spend 30 hours on it, and the game did not incentivize me to do so, because they have this terrible little mini game that I've spent too much time on already. Overall, kind of wrapping up, thinking about this game, it makes me think about Super Mario 64, the launch game for this platform, and how that game's platforming is remarkable, even to this day, comparing it to lots of other platformers. It's super strong, very versatile, very, what would be the word? I guess versatile would be the word. There's just a lot of different moves you can do, and it's very well developed. But then this game, and even Banjo-Kazooie, which Banjo-Kazooie is kind of a different game, they just don't have that kind of interesting platforming. Donkey Kong 64 doesn't have that kind of interesting platforming. They all went for a really basic thing where you kind of just jump to get over a gap, and that's about it. And there's other player verbs thrown in there too, especially with Banjo-Kazooie. But for this game, you kind of just jump and double jump. But the gameplay's decent enough, and what they build on top of it with the audio visuals is really strong, to the point that I would say this game is a 7 out of 10. It's a good game. I was thinking maybe with the N64 version being technically reviewed, maybe it's closer to 6.5, but really the the reason you play it is some very imaginative visuals with some decent gameplay to tide you through them onto the next thing they have to show you. Which, you know, doesn't actually sound like a 7 out of 10 as I say it like that, but it's a 7 out of 10. It's gameplay works, and it's a nice visual experience throughout with some fun ideas. One last thing I should bring up is I don't think the game being in 3D, it doesn't offer anything in that mode, in that perspective, that the Origins and Legends games don't also offer, really, other than, say, immersion. So that's all I have to say about it. That's my last thought. But in terms of where it would rank, it sits between Sin and Punishment and Ogre Battle 64. It's a little more it's better put together than Sin and Punishment, if not as interesting. And while it's not nearly as interesting as Ogre Battle 64, at least not at the outset, even though Ogre Battle 64 does overstay its welcome, but Ogre Battle 64, much more interesting game with more compelling gameplay. So that is where Rayman 2 will sit in the rankings. And with that, we're going to move on to the summary of my N64 series. So to start off my summary of the N64, I'm going to read off my rankings. And this is all of the games that I reviewed for the N64. So at 38, we have Conker's Bad Fur Day. At 37, we have Turok 3. At 36, Banjo-Tooie. At 35, Bomberman Hero. At 34, 007, The World Is Not Enough. At 33, the original Turok. At 32, Super Mario Party 2. At 31, Donkey Kong 64. At 30, Jet Force Gemini. At 29, Yoshi's Story. At 28, Shadows of the Empire. At 27, Perfect Dark. At 26, Mischief Makers. At 25, Turok 2. At 24, Extreme G. At 23, Beetle Adventure Racing. At 22, Paper Mario. At 21, Battle for Naboo. At 20, GoldenEye, 007 GoldenEye to be precise. At 19, Sin and Punishment. At 18, Rayman 2. At 17, Ogre Battle 64. At 16, Mario Tennis. At 15, Doom 64. At 14, Mario Kart 64. At 13, Kirby 64. At number 12, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. At number 11, Pilot Wings 64. At number 10, Smash Brothers 64. At number 9, Wave Race 64. At number 8, Rogue Squadron. At number 7, Star Fox 64. At number 6, F-Zero X. At number 5, Diddy Kong Racing. At number 4, Banjo-Kazooie. At number 3, Ocarina of Time. At number 2, Super Mario 64. And at number 1, top game, Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Perhaps one of you noticed I have moved Kirby down in the rankings, Kirby 64, and that is because I decided that I rated it too high at 7.5 out of 10. It's a very surprising and very interesting game, no doubt, but the basic gameplay and the level design aren't all that great, having played through it since that review on some of the streams, so it's more of a 7 out of 10, and that's why it's ranked lower. There are a few games that I did not review that I thought were worth mentioning. 3 of them I played, those 3 being Blast Corps, Body Harvest, and 1080. Blast Corps was, it was a fine game. I think it's kind of overrated by the N64 enthusiast community. I didn't think it was all that great, but I never finished it, so I can't say for sure. Body Harvest, super interesting, if not only for its pedigree, DMCA being the predecessor of Rockstar. And then 1080 was a game that I just couldn't get good at. It seemed really cool, but I just couldn't get good at it. I was terrible at that game. But, you know, I will always appreciate it for its menu select music. You know, the menu select music that's like, work your body, work your body, work your body, oh, push it out. You know, ridiculous. I love it. But I couldn't really get good at that game. And then there's like a few other games that I just never purchased, usually because of money, or I don't know, I just didn't feel like purchasing some of these, being frank. NFL Blitz, WrestleMania 2000, WWF No Mercy, Excite Bike 64, Mario Golf, Ken Griffey's Baseball, Rocket Robot on Wheels, which is supposed to be a very good platformer, Mystical Ninja starring Goemon, Goemon's Great Adventure. Both of those games are quite expensive, but well liked and considered, you know, great games on the N64. Then there's Quake. I believe Quake was on there, a version of it. And then there's Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, Pokemon Puzzle League, Space Station Silicon Valley, and Mickey's Raceway USA. So while I didn't review those games, I acknowledge them because they will come into play when I review the console and rate it. So before we talk about the console as a whole, I do have some awards that I wanted to give out to the games that I did review. And these are just haphazardly made up by me. So the first award, best looking game, it would have been an interesting conundrum that I found myself in, trying to figure out if Donkey Kong 64 or Majora's Mask or Wave Race 64 even, which of those three were the better looking game. But there's no conundrum because those games don't compare to Paper Mario. I'm not the biggest fan of Paper Mario, but it's a very good looking game on the N64 and just in general. So the best looking game is Paper Mario. The worst looking game, I have a few candidates, I suppose. Glover can be hard to look at, and what's that other game I just mentioned? I can't even think of it. Doesn't matter, but the worst looking game is Mario Tennis. Mario Tennis is just quite crude looking, and there's not much going on the screen, so you'd think they could make better looking character models, but the character models are really crude looking and the environments are flat and undynamic and just ugly. So that's the worst looking game, Mario Tennis. The Technical Achievement Award, I assume I have a few candidates, such as maybe Wave Race, because I think Wave Race is really cool looking, or Rogue Squadron. Interestingly, I think Wave Race is a contender in all of these categories, and I don't think it wins a single one. Just saying that to say that I really liked Wave Race. Ha, it's a hard word. Wave Race. And I'm sad that I couldn't give it any award. But the Technical Achievement Award goes to Majora's Mask, just for all of the aspects that go into the 3-day cycle, and also all the transformations that you can do, and all the texture work, really good texture work in that game. It's Majora's Mask. The best genre is racers. A lot of racing games, but they're all very, very good. Or, well, they're consistent in quality. Not all of them are good, but the ones I played were a fun time at the very least. I guess the worst genre, which isn't something I have on the page here, but I just thought it up, that would go to first-person shooters. First-person shooters, while the N64 is known for first-person shooters, it's kind of baffling that they were so well received, because controlling them, like trying to control a first-person shooter on the N64, was not a good time, even though Rare kind of made it work with GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. And, you know, if you were someone playing on PC, you would just think that the N64 is junk. For the other console players, maybe they just didn't have anything else to compare it to, and so they accepted the limitations of FPSs on the console. But playing them now, not happy with it. The best surprise, as I just mentioned, it's Kirby 64. that there was a few candidates. But Kirby 64, even though I knew the big hook with the game, I thought the transformation stuff kept that game fresh throughout its entire duration. Not that it was a terribly long game, but it whisked me away and made me not really focus on the fairly slow gameplay and, so level design, as I was just enamored with what kind of combination I could come up with all the powers, such as figure skates or a double-bladed lightsaber, clearly inspired by Phantom Menace. Even though there wasn't a lot of powers, just with all the available combinations, it kept things interesting and was a real nice wow factor. So much so that I overrated the game. But Kirby 64, the most surprising, or the best surprise on the N64. The inverse, most disappointing, and that would go to Ogre Battle 64. You could almost go to Donkey Kong 64 or some of the rare games. Just a lot of rare games were disappointing, but Ogre Battle 64 was a game that I had built up in my head as being this very complex, interesting strategy RPG. And while it is initially all of that stuff, ultimately I found the game offered up a lot of complex solutions to very simple problems. And as I played it for 90 or so hours, I realized that a lot of the issues I was running into were self-made, and I was just overcomplicating things. And it's a pretty simple strategy RPG. The strategy is pretty simple. And the game has some other problems too, but mostly it's that. The best multiplayer, that would go to Smash Brothers 64. There's a few candidates, but Smash Brothers 64 is still fun to play in multiplayer. Playing it single player, it's pretty bare bones, but the multiplayer still holds up, and there's this nice kind of sense of reversal and re-reversal, lots of reversals as you play it, where it's very easy, to juggle someone and then get juggled in turn. Apparently the pro play of Smash Brothers 64 is broken, but for casual play, I think it's a lot of fun. It kind of gives it this sort of WWE, WWF sense to it as you go back and forth. The most resonant game. This award is for a game that I just think about. It's not necessarily a game that's incredible, but it's just a game that I find myself thinking about quite often. And this should go to Majora's Mask, as I think about Majora's Mask a lot, but let's just forgo that. As for this time around, the game that I played and thought about a whole lot after the fact was Pilotwings 64. Not an amazing game, graphically very rough, and it's a launch game, so it doesn't have an incredible amount of content, but actually the amount of content it has is sufficient for me, and I think for most people. But the thing that makes me think about Pilotwings 64 is just the act of landing your craft, specifically the gyro wing and the glider. That very tense moment where you're like at 2 meters as you're approaching the big ground target, the center of it, and then you stretch out your legs, and your guy, because he's coming at a very slow decline, he just kind of runs up and ends on the middle or close to the middle, and you get that little musical chime. What a great feeling. Or just coming down with no engine power with the gyro wing, almost skimming the center line before you ultimately, touch ground. It's a beautiful feeling. Also very frustrating to mess up these things, but just those feelings of perfecting simple actions makes me really think about Pilotwings. It makes me think about how games used to be in a lot of ways. And the next award is my favorite game that wasn't very good. Self-explanatory award, and the game that picks it up is Shadows of the Empire. Between a very mean and nasty life system and some bloated, mediocre plotting levels, and also simplistic gameplay, Shadows of the Empire is not a terribly good game. But there's lots of moments in it that are truly inspired. People bring up the snow speeder part, which I'm not actually that enthused about, but it's a pretty solid time. And then there's, for me, my favorite level is the train on the garbage planet, where you are essentially platforming between one car to the next, as you'll have two trains coincide with each other on opposite tracks, or you'll have to jump over low clearance, uh, overhanging obstacles, or duck those very same obstacles that are just slightly higher up. And then there's all the enemies that you'll be fighting, and then as the train curves around certain tracks that are curved, you'll have to be very careful about jumping because you may just be left behind. In general, that level's just so dynamic and awesome for an N64 game, for a game from '96. Reminds me of something cinematic like Uncharted in a way. And then there's the other interesting levels and interesting aspects about the game, such as the jetpack that you get that you can have in perpetuity, aside from one level where it mysteriously disappears. And as long as it's charged up, you can do some really cool long range platforming in larger areas. It's a pretty cool idea. And then, there are just some pretty solid levels all around. The final level, or the second last level, reminds me of a Zelda temple in some kind of way, with all the moving gears, and there's little hidden compartments if you ride down some of the teeth on these big moving cogs. And then, of course, the very last level that takes place in space. Super wowing, I was actually wowed by it. It felt so Star Wars like, and it was just this larger than life place that they designed, and it's essentially very inspired by the trench run or something like it. And I can't really describe it in words, but it's awesome. So certainly things to dislike about Shadows of the Empire, but there's lots of things to like as well. The most anger-inducing game, and the game that wins this award is Banjo-Tooie. Banjo-Tooie, it follows a collectathon that is essentially maybe the strongest collectathon to this day, unless you count Super Mario 64 as a collectathon, which I guess there's merit to doing so, but super strong game that it's following. And then it screws it up by going with a more is better approach. And more than that, it screws it up by mixing open concept levels with Metroidvania elements. And the reason that's such a bad idea is with these open concept collectathon levels, there's no strong indication that you're going the wrong way or doing something out of order, or that you're just wasting hours of your time because, it's open concept. And so that's what I did often in Banjo-Tooie, where it would seem that I was working my way up to something, and then would just find that, I don't have this move that I need to get in a level that's ahead of me, or maybe I need to backtrack to another level. And it's a bad combination. And then there's just really terrible, what would be the word? Demonstratively terrible design choices, such as when you're a little T-Rex, you need to open these doors by getting a roar, but you don't have a roar, so you need to talk to a random enemy NPC, which is a Stegosaurus type thing. But there's no reason to do that because, one, you don't want to go near these enemies in Banjo-Kazooie games anyway, because it's a waste of time usually. And also, you're a carnivore animal, he's a herbivore animal. Why would you two have a random discourse if you got near him? And that's the solution to getting this roar. Or there's things where you're doing the right thing, but you aren't getting the proper indication that you're doing the right thing, like this jail cell that you're in the carnival level. where you need to use egg grenades to blow up each of these iron bar doors. And they don't flash when you hit them with the grenade or deform or do something or shake or do anything. You just have to shoot them 5 times with an egg grenade, and then it will blow up on that 5th time, or I think it's 5 times. When I was there, shot it twice. There was no indication that it did anything, so I didn't bother, and I looked for something else like a switch or a key, and ultimately walked away from it. That stuff is kind of rife in a lot of other rare games, but it was so stupid to me, and it's just what's coming off the top of my head. And there's other problems with this game too, but Banjo-Tooie is infuriating, and I just wouldn't play it. I spent months sitting on this game, and it just was I was in gridlock with this game. I didn't want to give it up, but I didn't want to play it, and I couldn't play something else instead of it because I just want to keep with the game that I'm on with. Another negative award, the most self-sabotaging game. A game that has a lot of things going for it, and then it just introduces one idea that's fairly terrible and then mucks it all up. There could be a few candidates for this award. DK64, for instance, with its glut of collectibles and whatever. But the real winner is Jet Force Gemini. The first 10 hours of Jet Force Gemini are super solid. The controls can be weird, but I kind of understand why they went with those controls where you prioritize shooting when you're aiming, so the analog stick switches to aiming instead of moving, but then if you're platforming, then the movement switches to the analog stick, and then your aiming still exists, but it's mapped to the C buttons. Odd, but it makes sense. And it's just a very lively adventure with a really great structure, lots of production value, great music. It's a good looking game, and then the game devolves into, after the first false ending, this terrible scavenger hunt that can be lengthened through no fault of your own as you collect all of these little tribal people, these little koala bears who can inexplicably die from a random grenade, and you have to get all of them in one go per level, and should one of them die, then you have to restart all of that. And then there's other things you also have to collect alongside these tribals too, and it's just a terrible, terrible thing that happens to this game. The good news is, though, that they do leave a perfectly acceptable game outside of that. So, in a way, I'm not mad at the developers so much for Jet Force Gemini, but they do sabotage their game to make it into a 30-hour or 35-hour experience when it doesn't need to be. And then the last reward in quotes, is the worst game. And I'm not actually sure what the worst game is. Well, I am. It could be Conquer, but it's not Conquer. Conquer is the worst game that I reviewed. But the worst game that I didn't review, and I really shouldn't be talking about it, but I am going to anyway, and the worst game is Glover. Glover has some interesting ideas, but it's very shoddily put together with a horrible camera. And I'm not usually that bothered by cameras that put something in my way, in my line of sight, or put at an angle that I'm not terribly preferable to. I can get over that if I can still see my jump relatively, but the camera in Glover does not work. Every bit of geometry gets in the way of it, and it's terrible. And it's worse because you're doing a very fiddly thing where you're escorting a ball from one place to another. And that's probably the problem with Glover, is it's an interesting notion having this ball that you move around. But the controls are fiddly, for one. And the task that you're doing is fiddly and infuriating. And then you do it with a bad camera. And then the game eats your save, which is a blessing in disguise. And I was perfectly fine with that. And so I stopped playing it. That's Glover. I think it's the worst game I touched on this system. But, Bomberman 64 seemed pretty bad too. And then Conquer, which I did see to the end. has a lot of the infuriating things that I was talking about with Banjo-Tooie, and then some more problems besides. So those are my awards. Some of those being awards in quotations, of course. But now I'm just going to talk about the N64 in total and my journey with it, a summary, if you will. When I first started playing the N64 3.5 years ago, this, of course, not being the first time that I played the N64, but in this particular instance, I was hopeful about it because it turns out the games that I started with were Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Kazooie, Star Fox 64, and GoldenEye. And then shortly after that, I think I went into Rogue Squadron 2. As it turns out, those are like some of the best games on this system. So I wasn't intending to play all the best games first, but I did, as it turns out, and then I quickly descended into a lot of mediocrity after that point. Even so, I was optimistic about the N64, and prior to playing the N64 in its totality, totality in quotations, back in the day, maybe 2019, 2015, whenever it was, I had played some N64 games like Ocarina of Time, Star Fox 64, the 3D version specifically, Majora's Mask, Paper Mario, Mario Kart 64, and had a great time with these games. And then combined with the distant memories of games like Smash Bros. 64 and Diddy Kong Racing and GoldenEye and Turok 2, I felt like the N64 seemed like a solid console. But very quickly, a few of my concerns that I had at the outset, the two primary ones being that the aesthetics of the games would be a weakness for them almost across the board, with some exceptions, mind you, and that the games would bloat themselves into 30-hour experiences through bad means, padding and pointless difficulty spikes, or just like kind of confusing level design just to make everything take longer than it needed to be. And that is essentially what occurred with many of these N64 games. And in regards to that second point, there's no way of knowing if the developers intended these experiences to be needlessly confusing. But I definitely think they intended to make them more of a greater value proposition by padding them out. And I don't value length above all else as far as gaming goes. If you can make a 30-hour experience with meaningful content, then that's all the better. But if you can make a better 8-hour experience than a 20-hour experience, then you should be making a better 8-hour experience. But before I delve too deeply into the disappointments I had with this console, just to talk on the highlights. There was two genres on the N64 that were consistently good. One genre was racing. There's definitely a glut of racing games on the N64, maybe too many, and not all of them were good, but the big name ones that I had heard of, all of them turned out to be quite consistent in quality. Even if they weren't the best thing, they were still a fun time. Games like Extreme G, not incredible, but it was fun. Beetle Adventure Racing, people love that game. I'm not as enthused by it, as I find its decision to go with less tracks that are bigger ultimately falls on its face as you repeat those same tracks for reasons that I got into with that review, but it's still a fun game with strong physics and good level design, or good track design rather, for the few tracks that there is. And then of course moving to the really good racing games, Wave Race 64, I had so much fun with that game, and the way your craft moved on the waves and cut through them and followed the wakes of the other racers. All that water technology, super fascinating, and it's just a game that controls really well and is generally a good racing game. Episode 1 Racer, uh, as I call it, that's not the name of it, but you know what I'm talking about. That game is so fast and has a lot of content, and it has a really good track design with lots of little secrets, aside from Grabvine Gateway. But everything else about that game, super solid, a lot of fun to play, and the, the venues that you race on, they present a good Star Wars aesthetic. Very fun racing game to this day. Had a lot of fun with it. And then, there's other racing games besides, like Diddy Kong Racing, which I think is the best racing game on the console. And it's the game that we had over Mario Kart 64. We never had Mario Kart 64. Diddy Kong Racing. So much variety in that game, but that variety is matched by depth. So much depth in Diddy Kong Racing, particularly with the kart more than the other two vehicles. But the other two vehicles are a strong addition as well. And Diddy Kong Racing, just a great racing game to this day. Lots of ideas that you don't see in other party racers or racers in general. And F-Zero X, I'm not sure it's as fast as Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, but I can never get my head around that title. I kind of hate it. But anyway, F-Zero X, not sure it's actually as fast, but that game's controls are wonderful. All the little minutia between sliding and drifting and that little shunt that you do, I think it's called barging, that actually contributes to turning if you need it to, or the spin attack that you can do. All of it flows so well into one comprehensive move set, and combined with the speed, it's a super pleasing, stimulating racing game. The racing games on the N64, they're still a good, if not great time, even compared to racing games out now. Not that I'm a big enthusiast of the genre, but after playing on the N64, I am a big fan of racing games. Prior to this, I played Mario Kart, and now I'm of the notion that Mario Kart's actually pretty simple and typically not that much to write home about, even though it's still a good time. But the other genre that really shined through on the N64 was on-rail shooters like Star Fox 64 and Sin and Punishment, and I guess those are the only two on-rail shooters, really. There was a third one called Broken Spear or something, but whatever. Combine those with aviation action games like Rogue Squadron or Pilot Wing 64, which those games are kind of different, but I'm going to lump them in together. And, of course, Battle for Naboo, and maybe that was all of them. Regardless, those kinds of games, like Pilot Wings, like Rogue Squadron, like Star Fox 64, as unplentiful as they were on the system, they were consistently very enjoyable. Now, to zoom out from these individual games and even these genres into 3D gaming, these two genres that were successful on the N64, or the most successful, I find, they were not something that could be very easily done or done well on previous hardware. It was the kind of stuff that only with 3D rendering techniques could you actually make these two genres work, particularly with racing, but also just the same with these aviation action games, as I call them, aviation arcade, whatever you want to call them. You did have Pilot Wings and F-Zero on the SNES, but as much as I like those games and I really enjoy Mode 7, the genres to which they belong are very much compromised or limited by the technology, by the sprite technology. So it is interesting that the strongest genres on the N64 were improved by 3D rendering. Otherwise, a lot of the things that 3D rendering did for the gaming industry in these days, I'm not sure it was all that impactful. Not saying that it wasn't a necessary innovation, I'm just saying it wasn't necessarily an improvement at this juncture. Let's look at RPGs, which I'm not the biggest fan of RPGs, but just going off of the ones that I'm aware of. The N64 is dead in the water on this score, so we'll refer slash defer to the PlayStation. The PlayStation RPGs, Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, Suikoden, Xenogears, Chrono Cross, Final Fantasy Tactics, just to move into that subgenre of RPG. How do these games really compare to the likes of Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy 3, Final Fantasy 4 and 5, and Earthbound, Super Mario RPG, Lufia 2, Illusion of Gaia, Terra Nigma, Secret of Mana, Breath of Fire 2, etc., etc. I don't think the 5th gen RPGs actually compare favorably to the 4th gen. For one, they're extra long, which makes them unapproachable, and it's not necessarily a good thing that they're long. Maybe there's nothing the length contributes to. I wouldn't know. All I know is I'm not going to play a 60-hour turn-based RPG when I could play a 30 to 40-hour one. And then there's aspects like FMV and pre-rendered graphics. How well do those age compared to solid sprite work and good writing? So, as far as RPGs go, I don't really think the move to 3D rendering techniques really benefited them. And then there's first-person shooters, which, just speaking to the N64 alone, while they were a good idea on PC at the time and still hold up, many of them, the first-person shooters on the N64, as I already delved into before, it wasn't a good time. Not that the games themselves were outright terrible, but the act of controlling them on consoles, at least on the N64, it was disastrous. And it's completely outmoded now, and there's no compelling enough content, as far as I see it, to return to these games. GoldenEye may be the closest thing to this compelling content. It's a pretty fun game, and the controls kind of work in like 30-yard engagements, as I would call them. Anything beyond that, the aiming is just kind of terrible. But GoldenEye has a lot of problems that people seem to not address. And now that it's out on the Switch and it's come out of licensing hell, a lot of the problems that people weren't acutely aware of, they are acutely aware of now. And I think many people understand it's a deeply flawed game. I awarded it 7 out of 10, so I still think it's a good game, though specifically me, because I reviewed it with other people, I gave it a 6.5. I think that's the best as far as it goes when it comes to controlling an FPS on the N64. Every other game, even if the game was decent on other merits, the controls are garbage. It's no fun at all, and it's not worth returning to. And then the genre that the system was most known for, I guess, 3D platformers. I don't think these 3D platformers are all that good. In fact, the 3D platformers and collectathons on the GameCube, I think, are stronger. Take, for instance, Star Fox Adventures, which is not a super loved game. It certainly has a fan base, but there are people who really don't like it. Either way, I think that game is better than 60 to 70% of the platformers on the N64. And most of those platformers were developed by Rare, as was Star Fox Adventures, coincidentally. But the platformers that Rare developed, aside from Banjo-Kazooie, I think most of them were crap. DK64 being the famous example, but Banjo-Tooie is worse than DK64. Conker's Bad Fur Day is worse than Banjo-Tooie, for reasons that I outline in the review. Jet Force Gemini is not really a platformer, but you could kind of include it. That's a fun 10-hour experience, and then you leave after that first false ending. If you continue on with it, it's not a good time. And then Rare also did, Perfect Dark, which was worse than GoldenEye, at least as far as the campaign goes. Maybe the shooting was better, and so maybe the multiplayer was ultimately a better time. But overall, I think a worse package than GoldenEye. And so nothing that Rare did outside of two to three games was all that great. So they are, by my estimation, a very overrated developer. They still did some great games, don't get me wrong, on the SNES and on the N64, and up to this day with Sea of Thieves, which I haven't played, but it looks really interesting. But they made a lot of crap, much of which falls under the category of 3D platformer. And I'm not going to delve into 3D platformers anymore. There's some more negative examples I could go into and some more positive examples, but I'm going to forgo that for now. To speak to those who really enjoy the N64, I imagine a lot of your enjoyment may be predicated on the first party lineup. And I've seen people bring up the fact that the first party lineup of the N64 is actually bigger and stronger than the SNES, which there's some truth to that, as Nintendo really only dropped one game per franchise of theirs on the SNES, and then they acted as a publisher or platform holder for everything else. As for the N64, seeing as they had fewer partners by a large magnitude, they provided lots of the software themselves. And so each of their franchises seemed to get at least one outing, if not a couple outings. Something like Wave Race on the Game Boy got a sequel in Wave Race 64. And then there's Excite Bike, which had skipped the SNES. That came back with Excite Bike 64. And then they developed a bunch of new sub-franchises with spin-offs, such as Mario Tennis, Mario Golf, and Mario Party, and Paper Mario. And then there's Super Smash Brothers. How could I forget that? Obviously, the first-party lineup on the N64 was very strong, and many of these titles still hold up reasonably well. At the very least, they're good. Some of which are great. Games like Super Mario 64, a launch game for the N64, and still among the most compelling platformers and games that have ever been created. Just thinking about the move set of Super Mario 64 and how comprehensive it is and how subtle some of the differences between these different jumps and what you can accomplish with them. And then Ocarina of Time, what a benchmark for action adventure games, and it's still solid today, and it's pretty ironclad in its design decisions. And then there's Majora's Mask, which is super interesting, an interesting offshoot of Ocarina of Time. And these three games, they stand tall among Nintendo's best to this day. So if you're looking at the N64 through the lens of its first-party output, everything looks pretty rosy. But taking a broader view to paint a picture with the first-party stuff, it's like the King's Pavilion at the center of the camp. But then the rest of the camp surrounding the King's Pavilion, it's a shanty town with some tents closer to the King's Pavilion being nice as well. Things like Rogue Squadron and a lot of the Star Wars content is pretty solid. And then, of course, Rare's best offerings, Diddy Kong Racing and Banjo-Kazooie and GoldenEye as a third. And I'm blanking on anything else truly worth mentioning, being perfectly honest. There may be one or two games that could be thrown in there. Like Ogre Battle 64 is pretty cool, don't get me wrong. But everything else that I reviewed, I don't know, it wasn't something I'd ever play again, and it's something I begrudge spending 30 hours on. Oftentimes it was 30 hours I spent on this stuff. And yeah, I wasn't happy with it, and I don't think any of it is really worth revisiting. Even some of the first party stuff, it's super solid still, but Smash Brothers 64, the last version of Smash Brothers I really want to play. Well, that's not necessarily entirely true, but objectively speaking, it's the last version I want to play. Mario Kart 64, a similar story, though it's it is pretty good. And Mario Tennis, Mario Golf, would not want to play those versions above what came after. And a lot of that has to do with the graphics. The graphics of the N64 just make many of these games less appealing than they otherwise would be. Had they belonged on systems prior or systems after, I think they would be more appealing. Not that those hypotheticals are possible, but were they, these games would be more appealing, I think, just speaking in terms of graphics. And not that I want to end on graphics, because graphics aren't the most important thing to me, but I've run out of things to say, so I think we'll cap this segment right there. Now has come the time to rate the console. Give it a numerical rating out of 10. And I have constructed a marking guide for such an occasion, and for those watching the video version of this review, and there may actually only be a video version of this review. No doubt you're seeing it on the screen right now. Pause it if you want to read through it, but it's not going to stay up there all that long. So for the N64 rating, I have a few categories. The biggest one is the quality of the software, and that is out of 4. Then there's the quantity of the software, that is out of 2, because quality is more important than quantity. Then I have a very strange category called software of masterful quality, and that's when the best of the system, the top 5 games, let's say, they average out altogether as 9 out of 10 or higher. And so that category is out of 1, if that makes sense. And then there's graphics of the console of the N64, that is out of 2. And then there's console features and build quality, that is out of 1. And then there is the quality of the controller, that's out of 1. And so that's all out of 11, which doesn't add up to 10, I know, but we'll pare it down to a numerical rating out of 10 at the end of it. So to start from the top, quality of software. I took the 38 games that I reviewed, and I added up all their scores, and then I divided them by their number, which gave me the mean average of 7 out of 10. I actually thought it was going to be lower, frankly, but 7 out of 10. And that equates to 2.86 out of 4 for this category. Next category, the quantity of software. Again, I'll flash the marking guide up on the screen, and adding all the games that I reviewed, and also adding the games I didn't review but I believed would be worth playing. And any game that's a 6 out of 10 or greater is technically worth playing, which I realize actually means that certain games, how shall I put it? The greater the quantity of barely worth playing games, the lower the average of the quality of the software is. I'm well aware of that, but I can jig around with it to come up with the best outcome for the console, should I need to. For the N64, I don't think I need to do that. So, getting back to it though, there are essentially 50 games worth owning on the N64. Me being as objective as I can be, not being super subjective. So, looking at my marking guide, that actually makes the N64 get a rating of 1 out of 2 in this category. And then there's the software of masterful quality. And you have your top 5 games, which are Ocarina of Time, Super Mario 64, and Majora's Mask, all of which are a 9.5 out of 10. And then you have Banjo-Kazooie and Diddy Kong Racing, I believe. So those are your top 5 games. And you divide them by 5, and the mean average is 9.1 out of 10. So completely a 1 out of 1 in that category. So I'm giving the N64 its due in that regard. And then there's the graphics of the console. And you're going to think I'm very harsh, but I really, really did not like the N64 look. I understand it's of a time, but the SNES is of a time too, and the NES is of a time, and the Game Boy's of a time, and all consoles will be of a time. And just looking at it without going into, I don't know, excuse making, the N64 is a bad console to look at. Incredibly dated, maybe the most dated looking a console has been, if we're not talking about the Atari. And so this category is out of 2. I gave it a 0.75 out of 2. I thought 1 out of 2 was just a little too generous, and 0.5 was too harsh. There are some games that look good on the N64, or reasonably good, like most of the rare games. Surprisingly, most Nintendo games don't look that good on this system. They were really being utilitarian with the graphics, so 0.75 out of 2. And then there's the console features and build quality. At this time, consoles really did not have too many exciting things going on. The PlayStation could play music, though. It's pretty cool. And the N64, its big saving grace, that not being its software format with the cartridges, but it's 4 controller ports and the general sturdy build of the console. Most of these N64s you find, they still work today. Less so the controller, but that's its own category. So it's not terribly exciting, but 4 controller ports at the time was a big deal, and so it's a 0.75 out of 1. Some good console features overall. And then for the final category, we have the quality of the controller. I don't mind using the N64 with Super Mario 64. In fact, I like using the N64 controller with Super Mario 64. And I like using it with Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. I like using it less with Star Fox 64 and Rogue Squadron. And with first-person shooters, it's dreadful, as it is with fighters also, purportedly. Overall, I don't think this is a terribly good controller. It was the first controller with an analog stick, which is very innovative, no doubt, but I imagine had it not existed, Nintendo or someone else would have come up with a better controller. The PlayStation came up with a better controller within the lifetime with the DualShock. So yeah, great that I had an analog stick, and there's some interesting aspects about that analog stick, though it's not the durability of it. That analog stick is pretty fragile, and all the buttons are too cramped together on one side, and then you have the D-pad, which is all by itself unusable. I think the controller was comfortable enough to hold. Usually, just as a general ergonomic design, even though it left half of it inaccessible, but there's a lot of problems with this controller. So it's a 0.5 out of 1. So I add up all these values and I get 6.86 out of 11. And I don't have a calculator on me, so I have deferred to Google, and it tells me that that is a 0.6236. So we'll chalk that up to a 6.24 out of 10, which to those who have been listening for a while, you know I don't normally deal with decimal points past the 10th value. But with the consoles, every little point matters. So the N64 is a 6.24 out of 10. And with that rating out of the way, I am done with the N64. And I feel very happy to be done with it. Is it the worst Nintendo console? I'll just say I hope so, because I don't know. There are a few candidates yet still that could be worse than it, but I was not terribly happy with the N64. There are certainly some great games for it, but the act of pushing myself through mediocre games that were 30 hours long just to make themselves seem more valuable, I had no fun with that at all. And even though there was only 40 games that I played on the system, it took me a long time just to get through those 40 games because of their length. And so when I compare the games that got lower scores on the N64 to games that got lower scores on the Wii, I generally found that the games that got lower scores on the Wii I still enjoyed to a much greater degree because those games would be maybe 10 hours long. Games like Battalion Wars only got a 6 out of 10, but I still really enjoy that game a lot more than I enjoy Donkey Kong 64 or Jet Force Gemini or Yoshi's Story, even though Yoshi's Story is actually pretty short, or whatever, because Wii games generally tended to be short. And, you know, going beyond lesser games into just comparing the consoles, which I almost should be putting the Wii through the marking guide as well, but I haven't played the entirety of its library. I've only played 30 games for it. But just with those 30 games, I vastly prefer the Wii over the N64, so much so that I get this notion that maybe the Wii is the best console that Nintendo ever made, and I think that's a ludicrous notion to have. I think the Wii is kind of right in the middle of the consoles that they made. But I really enjoy the Wii, and I enjoy it a lot more than I enjoyed the N64. And I think about how much of a fool I was when I determined that I was tired of the Wii and wanted to move on to the N64. And now that I've completed the N64, what console am I going to move on to now? Am I going to go backwards? Am I going to go forwards? Am I going to skip over the SNES and do the NES? Or go back to the Wii even, or the Wii U, or the GameCube? I'll tell you right now, I have no intention of reviewing the NES. I determined that life is too short to be playing 40 to 50 NES games. No doubt I still will be familiarizing myself with the NES for my own self-edification, and more than likely the edification of those who watch my content on the channel. But I have no intention of reviewing the NES. Every other console I still intend to review, but I have not decided which console I'm going to be reviewing next. In fact, the only thing I've decided is that I'm going on a break. I've spent three and a half years on the N64 and on this commitment to review these games that I played on the N64, and it was a lot of work. Sometimes I slacked off and procrastinated, but when I actually worked on it, I worked on it. And I need a break now. I need a couple months off. I still intend to live stream here and there, but I am not going to be doing any reviews. And maybe going forward, I'll stop doing reviews altogether. Probably not. I'll probably still keep doing reviews, but I need a break from it. It's a lot of work. But to be clear, I am going to be returning to making content and will continue to make content on this channel for the future, Lord willing. With that said, that will bring this video to a close, and that will bring this entire review series on the N64 to a close. To those who have been listening from the start, I'm very grateful and thank you. And to those who have jumped in more recently, be sure to check out my past reviews on the N64 and also on the Wii as well. And should you do so, please be sure to leave a like. I would greatly appreciate it. And to those who have questions or comments, you can send them to the email nalistenerq@gmail.com, or you can put them down in the comments below where I will be sure to find them. But until my next video or live stream, I hope you have a God bless day. Thank you.